"You're a disgrace to that uniform," the retired officer spat, standing inches from the Black Royal Guard's face, desperate to provoke him. But Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Okoro didn't flinch, and when he finally spoke, the entire courtyard fell silent. So what exactly did he say that shut the old officer down and made tourists applaud? Before we reveal the moment that changed everything, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, its golden rays catching on the polished brass buttons of Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Okoro's scarlet tunic. The morning air carried a crisp chill, causing tourists to pull their jackets closer as they gathered in excited clusters, their hushed conversations and camera clicks forming a constant backdrop to the ceremonial stillness of the Queen's Guard. Staff Sergeant Okoro stood with perfect precision at his designated post, the 6-foot bearskin cap adding to his already impressive height. His posture was immaculate. Shoulders squared, chin lifted at the exact regulation angle, white-gloved hands holding his ceremonial rifle with textbook precision. The morning light emphasized his strong features, high cheekbones, defined jawline, and eyes that maintained the practiced 1,000-yard stare of the Queen's Guard, seeing everything while appearing to focus on nothing. Born to a Nigerian father who had served in the British Army's Royal Engineers, and an English mother whose family had a 3-generation military legacy, Okoro's path to the Queen's Guard had been paved with exceptional discipline and dedication. He had graduated near the top of his class at Sandhurst, completed 2 tours in Afghanistan with distinction, and earned multiple commendations for valour under fire before being selected for the prestigious ceremonial duty. Okoro's military record spoke of a man who embodied the higher standards of British military tradition. His knowledge of regimental history was encyclopedic, his understanding of ceremonial protocol flawless, and his dedication to upholding the honour of the uniform absolute. Fellow guardsmen often remarked that no one took the traditions more seriously than Okoro. He studied historical accounts of the Guard's actions dating back centuries and could recite the origins of each ceremonial gesture with scholarly precision. As tourists flowed around him like water around a stone, Okoro maintained his perfect stillness, a living embodiment of the discipline and continuity that had defined the Queen's Guard for generations. Children pointed, adults took photographs, and guides explained the significance of the uniform in hushed tones, but Okoro remained motionless, his awareness extending to every corner of his post, while his exterior revealed nothing but ceremonial perfection. For Okoro, the scarlet tunic represented more than just a ceremonial role. It was the physical manifestation of values that transcended time and politics: duty, honour, service, and the unbroken chain of tradition that connected today's guards with those who had stood watch for centuries before them. Colonel Richard Brampton, retired, moved through the palace grounds with the stiff-legged gait of a man who had spent decades enforcing military posture despite his body's protests. At 72, his once imposing frame had begun to collapse inward, shoulders hunched slightly despite his attempts to maintain the bearing expected of a former officer. His tweed jacket, once a fine garment, showed signs of wear at the elbows and collar, while his regimental tie sat slightly askew, suggesting a man clinging to standards he no longer fully maintained. His thinning white hair had been precisely combed that morning, but the autumn breeze had disrupted his efforts, leaving errant strands standing at attention above his age-spotted scalp. Deep lines carved valleys across his reddened face, mapping decades of sun exposure during colonial postings and a lifelong relationship with whiskey that had left its mark in the broken capillaries across his nose and cheeks. You see, the changing of the guard dates back to the 1600s, Brampton announced loudly to a family of American tourists who had not asked for his commentary. I served 34 years defending these traditions. 34 years. His voice carried the clipped tones of a particular generation of British officer, vowels shaped by private education but hardened by years of barking orders across parade grounds in far-flung outposts of what had once been the Empire. The tourists nodded politely, their eyes darting to their guidebooks as they sought escape from the uninvited lecture. Brampton seemed not to notice their discomfort as he continued. Standards meant something in those days. A man knew his place and discipline was absolute. Not like today, everything's gone soft, political correctness undermining centuries of tradition. A young palace guide leading a tour group gave Brampton a wide berth, recognising the familiar signs of a former officer who had appointed himself an unofficial and unwelcome addition to the visitor experience. Security personnel exchanged knowing glances. They had encountered his type before and kept a watchful eye as he moved through the courtyard. The Queen's Guard represented the finest qualities of British manhood, Brampton informed a Japanese couple who smiled uncomprehendingly at his pronouncement. Men from the right families, proper British stock. Tradition matters, you see. Continuity. As Brampton rounded the corner into the main courtyard, his running commentary faltered mid-sentence. His pale blue eyes narrowed as they fixed on Staff Sergeant Okoro's position, and his already rigid posture stiffened further. A subtle shift crossed his features, lips thinning to a bloodless line, nostrils flaring slightly as he drew a sharp breath. "Well," he muttered, his tone dropping to something colder, "that's certainly new." He paused, fingers flexing unconsciously at his sides as he assessed Okoro from a distance. Very new indeed. Brampton's path altered, redirecting toward Okoro's post with deliberate purpose. The practiced smile he had worn while addressing tourists evaporated, replaced by an expression of mounting disapproval that carved deeper lines around his mouth. His pace quickened slightly, shoulders squaring as if preparing for an inspection or confrontation. "Excuse me," he said curtly to a group of schoolchildren blocking his path, the polite phrase delivered as a command rather than a request. "Official business." Brampton circled Okoro's post with the deliberate pace of a predator, his critical gaze travelling from the guard's boots to the top of his bearskin cap. Each circuit brought him closer, testing boundaries while maintaining just enough distance to avoid intervention from security personnel. Tourists continued taking photographs nearby, though several noticed the unusual scrutiny being applied by the elderly gentleman in tweed. "Standards have certainly changed," Brampton muttered, his voice gradually increasing in volume, as if testing whether his comments might provoke a reaction. "In my day, there were traditions about who could stand guard here, proper traditions." A young woman with a guidebook frowned slightly, overhearing the comment as she guided her children past. Brampton paid her no mind, continuing his circuit around Okoro's position. "The Queen's Guard represents the finest of British heritage," he announced to no one in particular, though his voice carried across the courtyard, "dating back to 1660, centuries of unbroken lineage and tradition." Okoro remained perfectly still, his discipline unshaken as Brampton moved increasingly closer. The old officer's scrutiny became more pointed, his movements more deliberately invasive of the customary space afforded to guards on duty. "I served with the 5th Regiment for 34 years, Brampton declared, addressing a small group of American tourists who had paused to watch the unusual interaction. "From Aden to Northern Ireland. Back then, we understood what it meant to preserve traditions." His gaze returned to Okoro, lingering on his face with unmistakable disapproval. "The regiments had standards, proper bloodlines, if you understand my meaning. Men from the right sort of families." An elderly tourist stepped forward, his Australian accent cutting through Brampton's monologue. "Excuse me, sir, but I think we should give the guard his space. It's disrespectful to crowd him." Brampton turned, drawing himself up to his full height. "I was a colonel in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, sir. I believe I understand protocol regarding the Royal Guard better than most." His dismissive tone left no room for argument as he turned back to Okoro. When I led men, we had clear understandings about who could serve in ceremonial positions. Appearances mattered. His emphasis on the word appearances carried unmistakable meaning. The face of Britain's military tradition should reflect Britain's traditions, wouldn't you agree? Okoro maintained his forward gaze, his discipline absolute, despite the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere developing around his post. The muscles in his jaw might have tensed slightly, the only possible reaction to Brampton's provocation, but even this was imperceptible to casual observers. "I suppose times change," Brampton said with exaggerated resignation, "though not always for the better. Some traditions shouldn't be diluted." With each passing minute, Brampton's commentary grew louder and more explicit, his thinly veiled references to race giving way to more direct statements. "My grandfather served in the colonial service in Nigeria," he announced, pointedly looking at Okoro. "Had dozens of servants. They knew their place in the natural order of things. They certainly weren't wearing the king's uniform and pretending to represent British heritage." Several tourists exchanged uncomfortable glances, a mother steering her children away from the developing scene. Palace security staff had begun to take notice, two guards in plain clothes speaking quietly into their radios while maintaining visual contact with Brampton. "The uniform demands respect," Brampton continued, positioning himself squarely in Okoro's peripheral vision, "both from those who view it and those permitted to wear it. Some simply don't understand what it truly represents. Centuries of British excellence." Brampton's restraint evaporated entirely as he stationed himself directly in front of Okoro, close enough that his breath created small clouds of condensation in the cool autumn air between them. "You know," he announced loudly, "my grandfather had a dozen men like you working on his estate near Lagos. They were excellent at carrying luggage and polishing boots." The deliberate emphasis made his meaning unmistakable. They understood their proper place in the world. A ripple of discomfort spread through the gathering tourists. A mother guided her children away, while others watched with increasing concern. An American man stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Sir, that's completely inappropriate. You need to back off." Brampton rounded on him. "This is between military men, civilian. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns everyone who doesn't want to hear that kind of talk in public," the man replied firmly. Several tourists murmured in agreement, forming a loose semicircle around the confrontation. Brampton surveyed them with contempt. "Modern sensibilities," he scoffed. "You've forgotten what made Britain great. When I commanded men in Northern Ireland, we understood the proper hierarchy. Men like him," he gestured dismissively toward Okoro, "served under proper British officers. They didn't stand guard over our royal traditions." He turned back to Okoro, stepping closer than protocol allowed. "I'd like to know who made the decision to place you here. What commanding officer thought this was appropriate?" "The Guard regiments have centuries of tradition, specific traditions about who could serve." Brampton's voice rose as his frustration at Okoro's continued non-response grew. "I earned my commission at Sandhurst when standards still meant something. 34 years serving Queen and country. I was decorated for valour in combat operations you couldn't begin to understand." He leaned slightly forward, examining Okoro's uniform insignia. "Staff Sergeant, is it? In my day, you'd never have received a stripe, let alone stood post at the palace. Your kind were assigned appropriate duties, cooking, carrying, cleaning, not representing the crown." The semicircle of concerned tourists had grown, many recording the incident on their phones, while others looked around for security personnel. Palace staff had noticed the disturbance and were conferring nearby, clearly monitoring the situation while assessing the appropriate response to a confrontation involving an elderly former officer. "Your people were picking cotton while mine were building an empire," Brampton hissed, his voice dropping to a malicious whisper that still carried to nearby tourists. And now they let you play dress-up in a uniform you haven't earned. It's disgusting. A young British Army veteran in civilian clothes stepped forward. Sir, that's enough. You're disrespecting the uniform you claim to care about. I'm disrespecting nothing, Brampton snapped. I'm defending its integrity. Do you think the men who died at Waterloo would recognise what's become of their regiments, African faces in British uniforms? He turned back to Okoro, his face now inches from the guards. Does it make you feel important, boy, standing here pretending to be something you're not? Your ancestors would have been carrying spears in the jungle, while real soldiers were defending civilization. Okoro maintained his perfect stillness, though close observers might have noticed the controlled rhythm of his breathing, a combat technique for managing stress under extreme pressure. His eyes remained fixed forward, giving no indication that he registered Brampton's increasingly vile rhetoric. The N-word, wearing the king's uniform, Brampton muttered, deliberately using the slur. They'll let anyone in these days, won't they? Quotas and politics destroying centuries of tradition? You're a disgrace to that uniform. Palace security was now moving purposefully toward the scene, but Brampton, seeing their approach, escalated further. My grandfather owned men like you, he spat, and they were grateful for the civilization we brought them. They knew better than to pretend they belonged among their betters. Sensing the approaching security personnel, Brampton made a final desperate attempt to provoke a response. He drew himself up, his aging frame vibrating with indignation, and deliberately moved closer, entering the space that protocol reserved exclusively for the guard on duty. I commanded real soldiers, men who understood honour and tradition, he declared, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. Not diversity hires playing dress-up. You're an insult to every man who properly served before you. Tourists had formed a loose ring around the confrontation, many recording on their phones while others looked on in shock and discomfort. A young family hurried away from the scene, the parents shielding their children from Brampton's increasingly vulgar language. I said, stand down! Brampton's voice rose sharply as he jabbed a finger toward Okoro's chest, stopping just short of making contact with the scarlet tunic. That's an order from a superior officer. You have no business wearing that uniform or standing at this post. Okoro remained motionless, his training holding firm despite the unprecedented provocation. The only sign of his awareness was a slight adjustment in his breathing, controlled and measured, the technique of a soldier managing stress in a combat situation. You're making a mockery of British tradition, Brampton continued, his face now flushed deep red, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth as his control slipped completely. Your kind should be grateful we allowed you into this country at all, let alone permitted you to sully our institutions. In a final act of provocation, Brampton stepped forward and deliberately planted his foot directly on top of Okoro's immaculately polished boot, grinding his heel down while leaning in to whisper, "What are you going to do about it, boy? Run back to the cotton fields where you belong?" The courtyard seemed to freeze in that moment. Tourists gasping, security personnel accelerating their approach, and Brampton's triumphant sneer fixed on Okoro's face as he waited for the reaction he'd been trying to provoke. For 3 heartbeats, nothing changed. Okoro maintained his position, giving no indication that he felt the physical violation of his person, or registered the vile slur. Then, with a precision that spoke of thousands of hours of drill practice, Okoro moved. The movement was not a flinch or startled reaction, but the deliberate, controlled shift of a soldier making a conscious decision. His head turned exactly 90 degrees to face Brampton directly. The movement so precise, it seemed mechanical rather than human. His eyes, previously fixed in the ceremonial 1,000-yard stare, now locked directly onto Brampton's with laser-like intensity. The shift was so unexpected, so contrary to everything tourists had been told about the Queen's Guard's impassivity, that several onlookers gasped audibly. "Colonel Richard Brampton!" Okoro spoke, his voice carrying the measured authority of command, despite its quiet delivery. The sound of his voice after such prolonged silence seemed to electrify the air. "I believe we need to have a word." Colonel Richard Brampton, formerly of the 5th Regiment, retired 1998, Okoro continued, his voice maintaining its calm, authoritative tone. Commissioned at Sandhurst, 1964. Final posting as regimental adjutant, not field commander, as you often claim. Multiple disciplinary notations, including a near court-martial in 1982 for conduct unbecoming an officer while stationed in Belize. Brampton's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening slightly as Okoro continued with precision. "You received no combat decorations during your service, despite your frequent claims. Your transfer from active duty to administrative roles followed an incident in Cyprus that was quietly dismissed through the intervention of your father-in-law, then Brigadier James Worthington." Okoro's stance had shifted to a perfect parade rest, his rifle positioned with textbook precision as he addressed Brampton directly. "I know your service record better than you might expect, Colonel, because it serves as a case study at Sandhurst on how personal prejudice undermines unit cohesion and military effectiveness. Your repeated conflicts with Commonwealth soldiers under your command created operational vulnerabilities that required intervention from the chain of command on 7 separate occasions." Tourists and palace staff alike stood transfixed as Okoro continued, his voice neither raised nor emotional, yet carrying unmistakable authority. "To address your concerns about my heritage and qualifications, my father, Major Emmanuel Okoro, served with distinction in the Royal Engineers for 28 years, earning the Military Cross for gallantry during operations in Bosnia. My grandfather, Sergeant Joseph Okoro, fought at El Alamein with the Royal West African Frontier Force, actions for which he was mentioned in dispatches. My British mother's family has served in the military since the Napoleonic Wars." Brampton's face had drained of colour, his previous confidence evaporating under Okoro's measured recitation. "I graduated 3rd in my class at Sandhurst, 78 places higher than your own standing. I completed 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Grenadier Guards, receiving commendations for actions under fire that saved British lives. I speak 4 languages and have completed advanced training in tactical operations that didn't exist during your time in service." Okoro's gaze remained steady, his voice unwavering. "The tradition you claim to defend, Colonel, is not one of skin colour, but of excellence, discipline and service. The first black soldiers served in British regiments in the 1700s, fighting with distinction while men who looked like you still debated whether they were fully human. So when you speak of tradition, I must question your understanding of our actual military history." Around them, several veterans among the tourists had instinctively straightened their postures, recognizing the moral authority in Okoro's address. "This uniform," Okoro continued, "represents values that transcend your narrow understanding of heritage. It stands for discipline, duty, and excellence. Qualities determined by character, not complexion. My record of service has earned me the right to wear it, just as your conduct very nearly cost you the same privilege." Okoro's voice took on a note of quiet strength. "I will not respond with anger, Colonel, because that would dishonour this uniform and the traditions I uphold. I understand that you come from a generation with different perspectives, but respect is earned through conduct, not conferred by colour." His gaze remained level, unflinching. "The military values of honour, courage and commitment are not diminished by my wearing this uniform. They are continued. My presence here doesn't erase tradition. It affirms that the true tradition of the British military is excellence in service, regardless of background." "Now, Colonel," Okoro concluded with quiet dignity, "as one serviceman to another, I must return to my duties. The tradition you claim to revere requires me to maintain my post with discipline and focus. I trust that as a former officer who understands duty, you will respect that obligation and remove yourself from this area immediately. With the same precise movement with which he had broken his stance, Okoro returned to the ceremonial position, eyes forward, posture perfect, the embodiment of military discipline restored as if the interruption had never occurred. Brampton stood frozen, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The assured righteousness that had fueled his confrontation moments before had evaporated, leaving him visibly unmoored in the wake of Okoro's composed response. "That's not," he began, then stopped, his usual command of language abandoning him. "You don't understand. Things were different." His words lacked their previous conviction, sounding hollow even to his own ears. The crowd around them remained silent, tourists and locals alike bearing witness to the unexpected exchange. Several older men, who carried themselves with the subtle markers of military service, nodded slightly in approval of Okoro's response. "My regiment had traditions," Brampton tried again, attempting to recapture his authoritative tone. "Centuries of tradition that shouldn't be," he gestured vaguely, unable to directly state what had seemed so clear to him minutes before. Okoro maintained his ceremonial stance, eyes forward, the perfect embodiment of the discipline Brampton claimed to revere. This silent dignity seemed to unnerve the former officer more than any verbal response could have. Two security personnel arrived, one positioning himself near Brampton, while the other approached with professional courtesy. "Sir," the security officer addressed Brampton quietly, "I need to ask you to move along now. You're disturbing the peace here." Brampton looked from the security officer to Okoro, and back again, the realization slowly dawning that he had no allies in this confrontation. The certainties that had guided his life, the hierarchies he had taken for granted, were being rejected not just by the young guardsman, but by everyone around him. "This isn't right," he muttered, though his protest sounded increasingly like the complaint of a man who could no longer recognize the world around him. "Things shouldn't change like this." An older man in a Royal Navy veteran's cap who had been watching the exchange stepped forward. "The young sergeant has it right," he said quietly. "The uniform's about service, not colour. Always has been, for those who understood it properly." Brampton's shoulders slumped slightly as he took a step back, his military bearing failing him for the first time. For a moment, he looked not like a decorated officer, but simply an old man confronting the obsolescence of his world view, confused, defensive, and suddenly very alone. From across the courtyard, a senior officer in the formal uniform of the Guards Division had appeared, summoned by security reports of the disturbance. He observed the scene briefly before approaching. The crowd parted respectfully as he made his way to Okoro's position. The officer paused before Okoro, who maintained his ceremonial stance with perfect discipline. The officer offered a subtle nod, nearly imperceptible but conveying clear approval, before turning his attention to Brampton. "Colonel Brampton," he said quietly, "I believe it's time for you to leave the grounds. Your behaviour today has been inconsistent with the values of the service you claim to honour." As security personnel gently but firmly guided Brampton toward the exit, he looked back at Okoro one final time, his expression unreadable. A complex mixture of anger, confusion, and perhaps the first glimmerings of shame. The senior officer remained briefly, speaking in hushed tones to a security supervisor, while occasionally glancing toward Okoro with what appeared to be respect. After a moment, he approached Okoro's position again. "Carry on, Staff Sergeant," he said simply before departing, the brief acknowledgement speaking volumes about his assessment of how Okoro had handled the situation. As the morning progressed, tourists continued to flow through the courtyard, many pausing to observe and photograph Staff Sergeant Okoro at his post. Though he had returned to perfect ceremonial stillness, there was a subtle difference in how visitors regarded him. A deeper respect in their gazes, a greater care to maintain appropriate distance from his position. Several veterans who had witnessed the confrontation made a point of offering a proper salute as they passed, the gesture conveying a silent message of solidarity and respect that required no words. Parents could be overheard explaining to their children not just the tradition of the Guard, but the importance of the values they represented: duty, discipline, and dignity in the face of provocation. Have you ever witnessed someone responding to prejudice with dignity rather than anger? How do you think such restraint impacts both the person expressing prejudice and those observing the interaction? If you found yourself facing such blatant disrespect and racism, would you be able to maintain your composure and respond with facts and dignity rather than emotion, as Staff Sergeant Okoro did? If you appreciated this story of dignity in the face of discrimination, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more Royal Guard stories that reveal the character behind the uniform. Don't forget to press the bell icon so you never miss our daily uploads. Share this video with someone who believes in standing firm against prejudice without sacrificing their own dignity. Our previous videos are appearing on your screen right now. Check them out next. We'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another brand new story.